Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Hello and welcome to Down with D&D. My name is Shawn Merwin. I'll be your host today. And today we have a very special treat. Our guest host is RPG designer and one of the most creative people I've ever had the pleasure to work with, Mr. Will Doyle. Will, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I'm a big fan of the show. So.
Oh, well,
yeah.
So that's you. Okay, I was wondering who it was, and now I know. So for D&D fans out there who play Adventurers League, Will, you're well known for your work on the epic adventures that have been the highlight of many in the Adventurers League Forgotten Realms campaign. You've also worked on regular Adventurers League adventures, which are almost always highly regarded by the players and the DMs. You've worked on the two most recent D&D Open events. You win like the one-page dungeon contest every year, it seems like, or at least come in second place maybe every once in a while. What people might not know, though, is that you contributed to a few of the Adventurers League, to some of the Wizards of the Coast hardback books as either a designer or a cartographer or both, including Tomb of Annihilation, where you were one of the three main designers, and then Storm King's Thunder and Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. And now you are the content manager for the brand new Eberron campaign called Oracle of War for the D&D Adventurers League. And you have a day job and a family. So the most important question is, when do you sleep, if at all?
No, I don't sleep much, but I need to. I need to more. But somehow it manages to work out. I work in video games as a designer, so I'm used to a bit of crunch and deadlines and stuff like that. So it's somehow we get there. Yeah,
I will be working at my desk at 8 o'clock at night, which would be, since you're in the UK, like 2 or 3 in the morning. And I will see you answer an email or pop up for a post. Yeah. And then when I'm awake early in the morning, you're obviously already awake and at work. And I'm like, how can this man do this? No. But you are continuing to do it, and it's amazing.
Somehow, yeah.
Yeah. So the experiences you have as a video game designer, how is that translated for you working on tabletop role-playing games?
Well, in a number of ways, really. I've been working as a video gamer pretty much all my life, for about 20 years now, as a designer for about 20 years. So it's it is my life in a way. But I guess the big things that I've taken from it, one of the things you learn when you work in the video game industry as a designer is that nobody reads anything. So, you're trying to write down documentation and you just know that people see walls of text and they don't, they tune out. And especially when you're pitching stuff or dealing with, company directors and stuff, it's quite tricky to get your thoughts across. So you learn to write very, very concisely. And a lot of my work is kind of summarizing in the smallest, in the shortest way possible, what's cool about something. So I think that's definitely affected it. I've learned a lot from that. I've also learned that you learn to take a lot of criticism. Like as a designer, you're just getting it from all sides, and people are upfront with it. So you develop a very, very thick skin. Sometimes I feel that I go to work and I just have all day long people say how rubbish my ideas are.
and those are your friends.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. So that helps a lot. Because, you learn to kind of, you learn a lot of stuff, like you learn to sift through stuff and look at trends in what people are saying about what's wrong with something and kind of focus on the important stuff and not get caught up in all the little things. So that's very useful for designers in general. And I guess another thing I learned from the industry is that when I started in video games, I was very, very much sort of a mechanical designer. I was really interested in the systems of video games, and I remember always being frustrated that you'd be working with a publisher or a marketer, and you'd be trying to explain something to them that's quite mechanical, but actually is the essence of what your game is about, and they'd sort of glaze over, and then they'd say, "Right, so has it got ninjas in it?" And this was obviously many years ago when ninjas were much more of a big thing, but
Sure.
but everybody wanted ninjas in it. Everybody wanted aliens back then, and that used to really, really frustrate me. But then I realised over the years that they were actually kind of right. That you need to have this big picture, this big kind of story that people can just grab hold of. And so actually I realised that while the mechanical design is obviously really important, it has to be hooked on to some sort of narrative or story or theme that is going to draw people in. And it's really those themes that work more than anything else.
Right, and that kind of goes along with the criticism thing, right? Is there's always that constant feedback, and the customer isn't always right, but all your customers are usually always right.
Yeah.
If they're saying the same thing, and so that's why it's important, as you say, to hone in on the important things that will help improve either the product you're working on at the time or the next one. As you receive that information.
Absolutely.
That's
I mean,
a great point.
it's certainly really, we do a lot of user testing and, sometimes with, hundreds and hundreds of players, and you always get, you get the feedback from some people that's very, very specific and, goes right down into the weeds, and that sort of stuff isn't actually as useful as somebody that just says, "Oh, I didn't really understand what the main character's story was about," or something like that. And those are the kind of high-level stuff that when you start seeing patterns like that emerge again and again, those are the big things to fix.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned story, because for our main topic today, we're going to talk about storytelling in role-playing games, in tabletop role-playing games. But before we get to the main topic, I wanted you to just take a moment, if you could, and talk about your history with D&D, how you got into the game, what attracted you to the game, and then how it translated to what you're doing now, both in your day job and in tabletop RPGs.
Sure. So I've been playing RPGs all my life. I actually started with Call of Cthulhu, and then when I was very, very young, and it was too much for me and my brother to understand. And we moved on to other different systems, and eventually came to D&D, and we never actually played it that much to begin with. We played a lot of other systems, but then we kind of gravitated back to it. And, back then we were playing a kind of strange mix of first edition and second edition and, whatever, all kind of munged together. Right. And it kind of stuck with us. And me and my friends have been playing long Dungeons and Dragons campaigns for years now.
So I'm going to interrupt you. I have an interesting question, because you are obviously from the UK. So what games other than D&D or were popular, as you were growing up, or, was D&D as popular in the UK as it was in the US?
It was very, very popular. Like over here, it came to us through a company called Games Workshop, and then there was a kind of that they were distributing D&D back then, because they were a sort of retailer originally, and then they got into it and they started making their own books, and it did become very popular. But they also, other UK based companies started making their own RPGs, and my first exposure to role playing was with a game called Dragon Warriors, which was a really, really sort of simplified version of it, and it came in these sort of small paperback format. Like sort of like small novels, which looked like the fighting fantasy books, and the fighting fantasy books were massive over here. They're obviously UK based and went on to sell millions worldwide. And And so I thought this Dragon Warriors book, when I picked it up from the bookshop, was another fighting fantasy book where you'd kind of choose your own adventure, you know, and go to different page numbers. And I was completely mystified by it when I was reading it. I was thinking, well, you know, it's not telling me what page to turn to. So, you know, how does this work? But it was very good. And that was a big game over here. And it led in, you know, it was a gateway into D&D, which was obviously still available. But, you know, we had other games with Games Workshop. There was a lot of kind of, board games that were very popular that all had kind of fantasy themes and, you know, like I say, all became gateways into role-playing itself.
Cool. So when did it become a bigger thing? When did D&D become a bigger thing in your life then? So
for me, it feels like not that long ago, but it was actually 8 years ago now, I think. It was during 4th edition D&D, and they had a dungeon magazine, and they put out a call periodically for contributors. And I remember I was just on my lunch hour, and I put together an application for an article, and that got accepted. That was for one of the tavern profile articles, and then later I pitched my first adventure, and then I had a lot of success with that, and very rapidly they started coming to me and asking if I could help them out, and I would pitch more things to them, and I ended up publishing 5 adventures, I think, in Dungeon Magazine. And then when 5th edition came out, they approached me because of the magazine work and asked if I'd like to write some stuff for the Adventurers League. And then while I was doing that, I always spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, the one-page dungeon. I always enjoy mapping. And Chris Perkins got in touch with me and asked me to help him out with mapping the Giants' Lairs in Storm King Thunder, which was great fun, and obviously a chance to kind of contribute to that in a way, because it was, you know, it was kind of that sort of design work as well as cartography. He didn't supply me with maps and tell me to make them look pretty. I was kind of doing the draft maps for that product, which another cartographer then took on and did properly. And then that led to Tomb of Annihilation, and then recently Baldur's Gate. I was made a guild adept for the Dungeon Masters Guild, which I had a great fun doing. And now here I am with you as an admin for the Oracle of War.
Yeah, and that has been going very well. I think so far the reaction has been pretty positive. The story, I think people are really digging. We have the first 4 adventures out, so tier 1 is now covered, and I'm looking forward to finishing up another full year of that, taking us all the way up to level 20, which will be another adventure all in itself.
It will be. Yeah.
So let's get into our main topic, which is going to be storytelling in RPGs. So I've personally been focusing a lot on encounters, both as a designer and as someone who just thinks about writing and thinks about adventures and writes a column about it. I've focused in on that because that's where my focus has had to be for the last, I don't even know how many years. And I fear that, to mangle an old adage, that I may have been focusing too much on the trees of encounters and missing the forest of story. So this has been on my mind a lot recently. And one thing I really admire about all of your work that I've had the great fortune to run, to read, to play, is that story is always so interesting and so intriguing in your adventures that I barely realized that, you know, there are cool encounters in it, because it just all seems so good. And so I want to know, when you plan campaigns, especially one like the Oracle of War, where it's not just one adventure, right? It's 20 adventures over 20 levels. How do you come at that from a story perspective?
Well, first off, thank you. I'm glad you like my adventures, but oh wow, there's a whole load of stuff.
Yes,
to break down here. So, I guess for me, like first off, this is a kind of the obvious thing is I read a lot and I watch a lot of movies and TV shows, and I try and get out in the world a little bit, you know, and all of that, you know, comes together as something you can kind of draw on a little bit. But that's the obvious stuff, I guess. I think really, when you're talking about campaign stories, it's always a good idea to start small. I remember in 4th edition, you know, 4th edition D&D came with this campaign world, but it was really, it was just a veil, you know, a single country. And it kind of started around really just a single town. And I think that's always important. It's always for players, in order to take on and comprehend the world that you're trying to sell to them, they need to have that in bite-sized chunks.
Sure.
So I think, you know, it's like we have with the Oracle of War, we have focused very much on the Mournland and this little town on the edge of the Mournland. And it is, the Mournland in itself is a kind of weird, kind of alien blasted battlefield. And a lot of stuff can happen there. And you don't have to worry so much in that case about all the other stuff that's going on in Eberron and all the other things that make Eberron what it is. You're just focusing on those little adventures to begin with. And I think that applies to any campaign, you know. Don't throw your players right into the middle of a trade embargo, you know. Start off with, with the small stories that get you going there. So I think that's important. No.
That wasn't a rip on Star Wars, was it?
It wouldn't possibly be.
No.
And then another thing I think that is often overlooked, perhaps, is to think about tone. So, you know, what is it that makes your world, you know, what it is? And kind of like note down what those points are. So it's kind of like figuring out sort of key statements of this world, and applying everything through those lenses. You know,
right.
So it's kind of you know, with Eberron, we might say that you know, it's coming out of this terrible war, and so the recent war and the effects of that war on people should be present in every adventure that we do.
Great.
And you know, and you can kind of build adventures from that in itself. But I also look at kind of going, well, I want this adventure to just be, this one is going to be spooky. And this one is going to be, you know, about a hunt, you know, or something like that. So it's a really simple kind of guiding tone for the whole adventure.
Okay. Yeah, I love that idea of tone. One thing that I always bring it back to is Edgar Allan Poe talked about unity of effect, writing short stories, where every word in the story should be focusing in on that one thing that you're trying to get the story to do. And that fits, I think, with adventure design, because you can start your campaign with, like you say, start small. You don't have to give a menu of choices at the start. You can let the characters and the players kind of feel things out one step at a time, unravel this one strand that's going to go through the entire campaign. And as the players and the characters learn, you can open that up to change. The tone doesn't have to be the same from level 1 to level 20.
No.
But as long as they know that that's where they're starting from and they can grasp that, then, as you say, one adventure can be spooky, the next adventure can be, pulp action, whereas the next adventure can be heist. But you've always got that initial tone that you've set, that can be the guide that allows the characters to go off that one main path and then still come back to something they recognize.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think it's knowing what your key, kind of, tone principles are going to be. And then when if you make sure that you've got something to return to, they're like, okay, we're back in the place we know. And the campaign remains grounded because of that. So yeah, for sure. I think it's also interesting going back to all the different things that you can draw from. I often and it's a lazy trick, but I often go, well, I'm going to take something from this movie and smash it against something from this movie or from something from this book. And so, it works really well. So
it does. It's an age old trick, but it's an age old trick because it works. And that's what Eberron was initially, right? I mean, that's how Keith Baker pitched it, or at least in the stories, that's how he pitched it. It was Indiana Jones meets Casablanca.
Yeah.
Right. And how could you argue with that?
Absolutely. And, and when you're working with a setting like Eberron, those kind of clear ideas they give you a whole load of stuff to draw on, so watch a load of noir films and, it's just pluck little bits from it. But yeah, so what else? I guess, another thing, so when you're talking about the sort of the sweep of the campaign, where is it going to go? Where is it going to start and end is obviously really important. And what are the key beats that you're going to create across the whole campaign? I think it's important to have some understanding of that right from the beginning. But importantly, because it's, it is an RPG campaign isn't a straight story, it's an interactive story. I think it's interesting to look at those statements and think, how can you make them branches? So you can say, okay, midway through the campaign, the Queen is murdered, or the Queen escapes an assassination attempt. And what is the meaning of those different things? And it doesn't have to create branches that then go off into completely different areas. Your branches can still kind of dovetail back to the same path, but it creates different consequences within your chain of adventures that you're going to present, and that can be very, very interesting. It's exciting for you because as you're looking at it, you don't know what any one group is going to experience. But I think that's really important. We are making interactive stories. We're not dictating precisely what's going to happen.
Right. And I think the legacy events that we've put into Oracle of War, I think that is, an attempt to capture that sort of home game feel while still keeping it in an organized play setting where things that you do make a difference. It may not be a completely different adventure that you're playing because of those choices, but things that happen within the adventure definitely do change because of choices you've made in the past.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a lot of fun putting them together, and yeah, it's kind of the interesting thing with the legacy events is, I guess it's when you're making one, it's knowing how it's going to end rather than just throwing a load of stuff out there, and trying to kind of tie them in quite quickly so people see the change rapidly as they play through it.
Yeah.
So what else?
Anything else in terms of storytelling in RPGs and what you've learned over the years?
Yeah, I guess, kind of, so one thing that's, I always think is interesting is that so say if you have people often criticize TV shows for seeming a little bit aimless. And sometimes I sympathize with those show creators because they don't know. They don't know exactly where it's going to go. And I think we as dungeon masters, games masters, have a very similar thing that, often we don't know exactly where it's going to go, and we can't know because it's down to our players to some degree.
Sure.
So I think sort of developing as you go is really important. So sort of throwing stuff out there that you have an understanding of where it might lead, but it's not definite that it will go there, and see what people like. So I think in a home campaign that works really, really well. But I think there's also an element of that in our organised play campaign. I have an idea of where the Oracle of War is going to go, and it's quite a firm idea in places, but it's open to change depending on the feedback we get. And I also think, obviously, a story is based around characters, so it's often a good idea to try and focus your stories on those characters and the journeys that they go on. But for an RPG, keep them really, really simple, because players never remember stuff about people, and they glaze over when you start doing, backstory dumps or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, the guy with the twitchy eye, is the sort of level that you sometimes get to.
Yeah, and there's a term in literature of the flat character, and often people use that as a pejorative term. Although his characters are so flat, but flat characters are important. That it just means like a one-dimensional character, right? The flat character is the character that can be totally summed up with one word. He's devious. She is in danger. Whatever. And you're absolutely right. I think in RPGs, players have a hard time sometimes remembering their own characters, much less what is going on with this whole realm of other characters. So it's okay to have fuller characters, but you don't want to fill your world with them to the point that no one can keep them straight.
Yeah. So
having the one word defined character is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good tool to use as a game designer. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think players kind of latch onto it. I've often found in my own games that, I'll have developed characters whom I see as being really, really major in the story, but the players, meet a shopkeeper that I make up like on the spot because I wasn't prepared for them to go into that shop, and they end up, that guy's their favourite character, and they keep going back to the shop and, kind of speaking to him. There was one cleric that I had this gnome cleric who was always, whenever they went to the temple, he was always inventing something new. And it was as simple as that, that they'd always want to go and see him just to see, okay, this time he's making some big mechanical dragon and he's halfway up it and it's belching out flames, and it was really simple. It was like, that was the only thing that guy had going, but they loved him, Yeah. Okay. I suppose the other thing I would say, that I've learned about, stories is, I think often with adventures in terms of sort of templates. So I kind of think of it's really flows through adventures, or what this adventure is. So this adventure might be, this is a kind of this adventure is a sandbox, or this adventure is going to be a simple 3-path investigation, or as you write a lot of these things, you kind of develop these templates that you quite like, and I try and fit stories around those, so that creates variety within the campaign. So I try and say, so not every adventure feels like we've done the same thing, or we've done the same thing in the same sort of order, and that just helps keeps people, as they reach each new part of the story, they kind of go, oh wow, this feels different from the last bit,
Right. And then even when, as you learn those templates and you learn that rhythm of an adventure that you can go back to, or different kinds of rhythms, then you can take one of those templates and just give it a little twist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it doesn't take a lot of work, but the important thing is kind of like a jazz musician, right? You can't just pick up the saxophone and just play this amazing jazz. You have to learn all the notes first. And then once you learn all that, you can forget everything you've learned and do your thing. But understanding those templates and actually breaking them down and seeing what makes adventures tick is so important to being able to deliver a good story. That if you go breaking that template before you understand why it works, then it might not work when you break it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's why it's always good for designers to be reading stuff, and sometimes I've gone through periods of my life where my RPG group hasn't been nearby, and I've still sat down and read adventures, and it just becomes a nice thing to do, and as you read them, look at them and see what those templates are.
So thinking about this in terms of a role-playing game as a storytelling vehicle, what have been some of your favorite either D&D or RPG products in terms of delivering that story?
So for me, I think my favorite campaign, which was very, very story-based, was an old campaign for the original Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, which was the Enemy Within campaign, which I played when I was a teenager. I ran it for a few friends, and it was just amazing. I think it's there's parts of it I don't think have been beaten since,
Yeah.
But it has a wonderful kind of, in a way, it's a sort of rags to riches kind of story. So the Warhammer world is grim and dark, and it's a terrible place where disease is rife, and everyone's scrounging for pennies, and it's kind of low magic in a way. And so the characters that you play are rat catchers and outriders and mercenaries or shopkeepers, sort of simple roles. And in this story, in The Enemy Within, it takes you from that all the way through to the end of it, where the fate of the Empire rests on your shoulders.
Nice.
And this great destiny awaits your characters. So it's kind of like the core, in a way, of what D&D is, which is the start small, where you're fighting rat swarms, and at the end of it, you're fighting gods or whatever.
Nice.
And the Enemy Within starts off with, it kind of goes through, it's that interesting thing we were talking about earlier about it goes through different types of adventure and very, very different tones. So there's one adventure which is a big open world exploration, where you're kind of traveling around on a river barge, seeking adventure. There's another which is a sort of diabolic kind of murder mystery in a town. There's another which is about the fate of this city and all this kind of scheming politicians and stuff. So it's, it gets very political, but it always manages to keep simple, which I absolutely loved. So
yeah. I think the best ones have a rich story behind it, but also allow the characters to become part of that rich story rather than just hearing the rich story. Yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes I think the story, in a way, sometimes the story is also the world. That if I think back on, what was the overarching story for the whole Enemy Within campaign, well, it kind of changes as you go through it. But what I think the players remember is what the Empire was like and what life was like in this place. And there's some authors really do this, I think, where, actually you read a story and you think it's the world that shines through more than anything. And that's what grabs you. And you get these great world building stories. And yeah, you kind of forget what the main narrative was, but you always remember that city that book was set in or whatever, And I think D&D's can be a little bit like that. If you've got a strong campaign world, we're taking your players to, on a journey through this place.
Right.
So bringing out the world and its cultures and its religions and, is part of the story in itself. So.
Yeah, I think, you think through all of the D&D settings, and all of the best ones have that, right? Dark Sun has that story behind it that as you gain more power as a character, you have to start interacting with not just the immediate threats in front of you, but the threat that brought the world to where it is today, right? All the Sorcerer Kings, all the magic that destroyed the world to begin with. You now have a large stake in that as you gain in power.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it was interesting that in the 4th edition, they kind of codified that, that growth, that you had the tiers in that, where you'd start off at the heroic tier and then you'd go to the paragon tier, where the actual advice, was, okay, now you're beyond the, roaming around trying to find gold and, go into dungeons, and you're now dealing with, entire countries, their fate lies in your hands. And then you go to the epic tier and it's like, okay, now we're going across the plains, it's
right. So. Okay. So you are now going to create an adventure. You're going to write it. You get a story in your head. What is your process from taking that story in your head to getting it to an adventure on paper or in a file?
Well, I rarely in my head am able to come up with a complete story. I'll come up with, as some of the stuff we spoke before, I'll come up with these kind of, okay, this is the tone, this is maybe the template that I want to have in mind, this is the kind of, these are the different things I want to introduce maybe at this stage of the campaign. And it's really it's structuring those thoughts into some sort of format. So I always use a kind of what I just call a bubble chart, which is I'll get a piece of paper and I'll write down, okay, to use a rubbish example, I'll say, okay, it starts in a tavern. So I'll write down the tavern and I'll encircle that, and then I'll draw little spokes coming off that, and as ideas come into my head, I'll create new bubbles and then new things coming off that, and it allows you to kind of go in all sorts of directions, but at the same time, because of those lines, you're looking back, everything's connected in some way, and so that bubble chart then in some ways becomes a flow chart at the same time for the adventure, and it does end up in some cases looking like the scribblings of a madman.
Well, I'd say with you they probably always look like that. But.
Yeah, I am not going to show anyone any of these things, but like the ones I created for a big project like Tomb of Annihilation, they were just huge and bonkers, So, but they mean that obviously it's your thoughts as you've gone through them, so you can look at it and go back to it and understand it. So that's something I kind of always start with, just a brainstorming method, and then I try and break that down into the key beats. But really, as I said previously, it's good to think of it as choices. I think, often, people think, okay, well, yeah, what are these big story beats? But remember, again, it's interactive, so what are the big choices you want to put to the player? And this is something I've started doing increasingly, actually, is just writing down a bullet point list of decisions that players are going to have.
Okay.
Because that's absolutely vital, I think.
Yeah. I think my adventure design is similar. I probably don't write down as much as you do. The madman is all happening in my head, rather than on the page. But it is a matter of putting on many different hats. At first you are the storyteller, then you go back through it as you said, the player. And as the player, how would I handle this? What decisions would I want to have to make? So as the designer, then I put those decision points into the adventure. And if you go through your design, your story design, while you're doing your adventure design, wearing all of those different hats as the designer, as the DM, as the player, then the story gets richer and richer as you iterate through your different drafts.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing I do when it comes to drafting is that once you start writing it, I often, as part of the sort of self-editing process, I will go through and sometimes I'll just get a highlighter and mark anything that isn't obviously, there isn't a way for the players to learn this. And this is quite useful, that even a room description, you kind of go highlight, how do the players, are they ever going to find out about this? And sometimes it's good to keep some of that stuff in for the DM, because the DM also has to have an understanding of how this place came to be or how these people got where they are. But it's a useful measure just to go, oh, hold on a minute. I've put this paragraph of text in about this character's backstory. How are they ever going to learn it? So it's a useful trick.
I love that point about the DM, because many times I'll be writing something and it's exactly as you said. I'll write it down and I'll realize that the players will probably never know this. Should I leave it in? And I've started to get to the point where I tell myself, I am writing this for the DM. I am going to drop in jokes that only the DM will know. I am going to drop in information that the DM can put in his or her pocket and reveal in some way if they choose, but it doesn't necessarily have to come out, because we as adventure designers are writing for the DMs, and they deserve to be entertained as well. Yeah, I think.
Absolutely. It's like I said earlier about people sitting down and reading these adventures for fun. People do. So there has to be a bit of that for sure.
I want to ask you specifically, I'm going to put you on the spot. When you came up with the idea for your Pudding Fair adventure, which I got an opportunity to write some encounters for, and I was super excited to do that. That is a very weird adventure. It does not follow any of the normal patterns that you would have for an adventure. We talked about templates earlier. This kind of breaks the idea of even templates, because it is sort of a Groundhog Day sort of adventure, where things happen over and over again. Where did you come up with that idea, and how did you make it work as an adventure when it's such a strange way to tell a story?
Well, it was part of that kind of crossing the streams thing. I just thought it would be nice. I'd had for a while the idea of doing something based on Groundhog Day. That was the obvious inspiration. But at the time, the Guild Adepts we were writing stuff that was tying in with Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and nobody had taken Gnomes and Halflings, which was one of the chapters. And right. I just thought, could I possibly mix those two things, Groundhog Day and Gnomes and Halflings? So that was the kind of the concept of it. When it came to and then I realized, well, how the hell is this thing going to work? And I don't know where it came from, but really, because there's a kind of mechanic in there that there's all these different things that can happen. And obviously in a Groundhog Day scenario, they have to happen at the same time. Every time you repeat. So it was just a little bit of a breakthrough where it was like an event can happen when the players get there, and then that puts that time down in your log. So you don't say, we didn't say, at 10 in the morning this character does this. It's like you walk around the fair, and when you meet this character, you just note what time it is, and right now it always takes place then. I don't know where that thought came from. It was just, as I was kind of immersed in that story, it all came about. But yeah, there's some other stuff. I'm not going to talk about some of the other stuff there because there's some spoilers. But
right,
yeah, there were a few mythical things, I'll say, that I liked. Some sort of folklore things that I wanted to get in there. So
nice. Is there anything else that you would like to touch on about storytelling through RPGs?
I think that's it, really, for me.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, thank you.
I really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone out there for listening. If you'd like to support the show, there are many things that you could do. We have a Patreon at www.patreon.com/MMP. If you can give there for just even $1 a month would help us immensely with hosting and editing and so on. If you can't help us monetarily, giving us a review on whatever medium you listen to the show on would be helpful. You know, a 5-star review through Apple Podcast really elevates the show and lets more people know about what we're doing here. Or you can just talk about us on your social media accounts. That is super helpful as well. Will, where can people find you on the internet?
I'm pretty much just on Twitter nowadays. Mm-hmm. So I'm at BeholderPie is my handle there.
Okay, excellent. And you can find me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, or you can talk with everyone from Misdirected Mark at the forums at forums.misdirectedmark.com. Down with D&D is a Misdirected Mark production, the media arm of Encoded Designs. So, Will, what are we going to do now, good sir?
I think we should go kill some monsters in a narratively dramatic fashion.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Well done.